Thank you very much, Pete and Nicholas. And before we get going, I just wanted to say this is a very fraught moment in Canadian history. And it's so nice to come to Athens in the last 2 days and just remember how wonderful Americans are. And, for our country, it's really a tricky time. Flights from Canada are down 70%. People like my sister are not buying any American products. And we feel brokenhearted. We fought beside you on Normandy Beach. We stood beside you after 9/11. We've never abandoned you. And we've had the most peaceful, greatest non-militarized border in the history of humanity. And we're too nice to be resentful. But it's just been really meaningful to me because I married an American. My life was made in America. My career couldn't have happened in a million years in Canada. My kids are both American and Canadian and Irish. I've got one daughter completely Canadian at this point, the other one completely American, married to a Navy SEAL in SEAL Team 6. So this meant a lot to me to just be reminded of how much I love this country. Anyway, one of the great pleasures of travel, as I'm sure many of you experienced, is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, let's see if this is going to reach. In the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning. Or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which you were born, your social realm, doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality. The consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your cultural lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma, a thunderhoof shaman in Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social, spiritual, and ecological space. And that's an idea that if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of peoples around the world make up a kind of social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the biological web of life that you know so well as a biosphere. And in an early book, I coined the term ethnosphere to try to create an organizing principle for this human realm of life. And I define the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and intuitions, myths and memories brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is the human legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative and imaginative species. And just as the biosphere is being severely eroded with the loss of habitat and loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, would suggest that 50% of all plant and animal species are on the brink of extinction. But that the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When each of you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language isn't just a body of vocabulary, a set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes into the material realm. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day you were born, by complete universal academic consensus, half aren't being taught to children, which means they're moribund. Which means we're living through an era where literally half of humanity's intellectual, philosophical, ecological knowledge is at risk. And the reason this is so poignant is that it's happening in the very generation in which geneticists have finally proved the philosophers to be true. We really are all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is a total fiction. In fact, race comes down to nothing more than sunscreen and vitamin D. That's it. But the incredible thing is if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means that every human culture, by definition, shares the same raw human genius. And whether that genius is invested into technological wizardry, our great achievement in the West, or placed instead into the complex task of unraveling the mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the realm of culture. That old 19th century idea that we somehow went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand of London, that European society, like a pyramid, was positioned at the apex and down the slopes of which went to the so-called savages of the world, has been absolutely debunked by modern science and shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the antiquated idea of churchmen in that century that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And this stunning affirmation of the interconnectedness of humanity, genetics of all things has come to the fore to prove the truth of the fundamental revelation of anthropology, which was cultural relativism, the great gift to us of Franz Boas. And then what this means then is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture, by definition, is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 languages of humanity. And those answers collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with all of the challenges that will confront us in the coming decades. Every culture really does have something to say, just as each deserves to be heard, and none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. But the question comes then, what do you do about this? If you're a biologist, for example, and you identify an area of high species endemism, you create a protected area. But you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't sequester or freeze peoples in time like some kind of zoological specimen. Change is the one constant in human affairs. All peoples everywhere are constantly dancing with new possibilities for life. So when I was recruited to the National Geographic as part of their conservation mission in 2000, I was given the mandate as their anthropologist to change the way the world viewed and valued culture in the decade. And we brought together academics, we had conferences, we had endless meetings. My eyes would glaze over at everyone. And at the end of the day, I said, polemics are never persuasive. Politicians follow, they rarely lead, but storytellers change the world. So let's go out into the ethnosphere and tell the stories of culture. Again, that old Hollywood adage, don't tell, show. Reveal the wonder of this fundamental anthropological insight by taking people to the very heart and spirit of the ethnosphere. So let me do a little bit of that this afternoon. And let's begin in the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination, Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon the southern seas. And I was very fortunate to be invited to sail on the Hokulea, the symbol of the rebirth of Polynesian culture, named after the sacred star of Hawaii. And even today, the young men and women of the Polynesian Voyaging Society can name 250 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon, simply by watching the waves that come across the hull of the vessel. In the darkness of the sacred canoe at night, they can distinguish as many as 7 different sea swells moving through the canoe, distinguishing those caused by local weather patterns from the deep currents that pulsate across the Pacific and be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Now, the amazing thing about this wayfinding tradition of navigation is that it was all based on due reckoning. Due reckoning means you don't set a bearing on a compass, of which they did not have. You can only know where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. And what that implied for the Polynesians, a non-written culture, an oral tradition, is that the wayfinder sitting monk-like in the stern of the vessel over a multi-week journey had to remember every shift of the wind, every sign of the stars, every indication from the sea, and put them all together in a holistic way. And if that record of navigation, together with the order of its acquisition, was lost, the whole voyage could end in disaster. And it was the impossibility of using dead reckoning before the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer that led most European transports to hug the shores of continents until that discovery. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, from an ancient civilization called Lapita, the ancestors of today's Polynesians set sail into the rising sun. In 1,000 years, they went from New Caledonia to Samoa and Tonga and Fiji. And then for reasons unknown, they settled for 1,000 years. And then they set off again across the Pacific, 4,000 kilometers to the Marquesas, southeast to Rapa Nui or Easter Island, northwest to Hawaii, and finally, around the time of the Third Crusade, reaching the shores of Aotearoa, what we now call New Zealand. And in all of that time, they only could sail by the power of their insight, the power of their observational skills. And indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. Now, if we go from the greatest ocean sphere to the greatest forest, we enter the heartland of the Amazon, the homeland of the peoples of the Anaconda, in the northwest Amazon, in the lowlands of eastern Colombia, the Barasana, the Macuna, the Tanimuco, the Cubeos, the Carihona. These are peoples who believe that mythologically they came up the Milk River from the east, either in the belly of the sacred serpent or dragged in these sacred canoes. Each community found a river, and these societies today we now understand to be the direct descendants of the great civilizations that Aureliana documented with Caspar de Carvajal when they sailed down the Amazon for the first time in 1541 and did not find an empty forest. They found a forest that we now understand to have been home to at least 10 million people. And to this day, it's very interesting. Our perception of lowland life in the Amazon has been overwhelmingly influenced by the fact that the diseases swept away the native population in most of the lowland basin. The survivors of El Dorado were these small communities like the Guarani, like the Yanomami, like the Achuar, the Chimane in Bolivia, huddled against the eastern flanks of the Montaña, the Andean Cordillera, isolated from the east by geography and cataracts, and from the west by the great Cordillera itself that was not really traversed by roads until 1940s, right? And as anthropologists descended into the Amazon, we wanted to live with the real Indians. And so we found ourselves drawn to societies like the Guarani, who lived isolated, married amongst themselves, in open conflict with their neighbors. This presented this idea of the fragility of life in the Amazon, leading Betty Meggers at the Smithsonian to write a book called Amazonia, A Counterfeit Paradise. Like, you struggle to survive there. And that fit and narrative of an emerging environmental movement saying that the Amazon was in fact a counterfeit paradise, and if you cut it down, it'd destroy it forever. Hippie mythology. And these people, by contrast, had deep wisdom traditions, social rules and mores that facilitated trade and exchange, not war, not the least of which is a marriage rule that you have to marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never have any one practicing a distinct tongue. The children just wait, listen, and one day begin to speak. Their most profound cultural insight is the notion that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. This is a constant theme. Indigenous people never see humans as a problem. We're the only solution, because most of the relationships, as we'll discuss, are those of reciprocity, in which human beings owe their fidelity to the earth owes its bounty to human beings. More hippie mythology, the shaman as doctor and physician. The shaman of the Barasana won't touch a medicinal plant, no interest whatsoever. Their role is much more analogous to that of a diplomat who has to maintain constant dialogue with the spiritual realm, or perhaps a nuclear engineer who periodically has to go to the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. They believe that their rituals maintain the dynamic balance of nature. And these ideas are expressed in these incredible events like this one, where we made a film with cassava women to celebrate the harvest. And for 3 days and 3 nights, the entire community inside the great Maloko, which is a building thrice the size of this room, take yahe, you might know it as ayahuasca, continuously, as they become not just symbols of the ancestors, they literally become the ancestors. And in that state of liminal space, they eventually fly away to all the sacred sites, reaffirming their sense of ownership, but also their sense of obligation. Now, this idea of human interaction is a really profound one. I was saying to some students today, why is it that we do what we do to the earth? I grew up in British Columbia. I worked in logging camps. You can't even imagine the forests that we leveled. And I remember thinking in those camps, only someone who had no sense of any of this being animate and alive could do what we were doing. And that's the point. We are all products of our own intellectual traditions, and the ubiquity and powerful presence of our worldview should not suggest that it is in fact the norm. It's highly anomalous in human experience. If we have an extractive model, most societies, as I said, have a reciprocal model. Where did we get these ideas? Well, quite understandably, during the Enlightenment and before, as we tried to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, we threw out all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, but critically metaphor. When René Descartes said all that exists is mind and matter, with a single phrase, he deanimated the world. The world became a stage upon which only the human drama unfolded. As Saul Bellows said, science made a house cleaning of belief. Now that objectivity gave us great strengths. It birthed the scientific method, allopathic medicine, wonderful things, technology. But it also drove the way that we interact with what we see to be an inner world. What do I mean by metaphor? I was raised in the coast of British Columbia to believe that the forest existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry and sustained yield that I'd been taught in school, and I practiced as an engineer in the forest. That made me very different than my friends amongst the Kwakwaka'wakw, raised to believe that those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beef heaven and the cannibal spirits that you'd meet at the north end of the world, so that through the Hametz initiation, you could reaffirm the moral propriety of the world and the human place in that world. Now, whether that, does it matter? Is that forest the realm of the spirits? Is it just bored feet? That, who cares? What's interesting is how the belief mediates a relationship with profoundly different consequences on the ecological footprint. So if we slip into the Andes, where these notions of sacred geography are so profound, because in the Andes, you feel the land as being alive. A single frost can wipe out the agricultural production of a year, a hailstorm. There are landslides, there are earthquakes, there are, terrible movements of the earth. And for the people, the Runakuna of the Andes, their whole relationship is based on this dynamic sense of reciprocity, which is affirmed through ritual. So, for example, I've worked for 50 years in a beautiful place called Chinchero, not far from Cusco. And each year, the fastest young boy in every hamlet is given the honor of becoming a woman. And he's designated as a Huaylaca, a pejorative term in Quechua that means a wife that does not look after her family well. And donning the traje or the clothing of the sister of his mother, he has to lead all able-bodied men on a run of the boundaries. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at the plaza at 11,500 feet. You run down to 9,000 feet, the base of the sacred mountain, Antiquilca, and then you run to over 16,000 feet, and then fall away and climb again and cross two soaring Andean ridges over a long 24-hour day that is less a race than a ritual, less a prayer than an ordeal. And all along the route is the boundary of the community where there are these mounds of earth. You can see the Huaylaca there with the yellow balloon dressed as a woman. And at these itos, mojones, coca is given to Pachamama, libations of alcohol given to the wind. And the incredible metaphor, it's so physically difficult that through sacrifice, remember in Latin, sacrifice means to make sacred, you go into the mountain as an individual, but you merge into a collective that is once again annually reaffirmed both your ownership of the land and your responsibility to the land. And in what my wife calls my infinite number of midlife crises, at the age of 48, I decided to run this race. And I was the only outsider ever to do it, and the oldest man ever to do it, except my friend who was the caraca of the community, Don Geronimo. And I only got through that by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anybody in the 8,000-year history of the plant. But what really got me through it was I had, over all those years, baptized dozens of children who became my godchildren. I had those. And those are economic relations with the parents, right? And when all of my, and of course I bought countless cows. I can't even tell you how many pencils and school books and clothes and everything. And so when all my ahijados and ahijadas heard that their padrino was stupid enough to run this race at his age, they came out to me and they clung to me like limpets through the entire race, wiping my face with yerba buena. Si se puede, papa, si se puede. They just didn't want anything to happen to their cash cow. But these localized engagements with sacred geography become pan-Andean in great events like the Coyariti, where once each year, 50,000 to 100,000 peoples from all over the southern Andes converge on a sacred valley called the Sinicara, dominated by three tongues of a glacier called the Colcapunca. And this is a perfect expression of the fusion of Catholic and Christian beliefs. Catholic and pre-Columbian beliefs in the Andes. If you ask someone like my friend Nilda Kalanaupa, how do you feel when anthropologists come along and try to tease away from your belief system what came from pre-Columbian life and what was an imposition of the colonial experience, she'll say, it just gives us a damn headache. Because of course there are a fusion of all these things. And so the beautiful metaphor is you bring the cross from your local church on your back, high into the mountains, in the shadow of Ausangati, the most sacred Apu of the Inca, and then the crosses are planted by the Pablitos in the ice for 3 days. And down below, the women wait, they dance, they pray, and on the morning of the third day, the crosses, now empowered by the essence of the earth, are taken back to the community, down the trails, back to the local churches. And ice is taken from the glaciers to be brought to the elders incapable of the pilgrimage to complete the sacred cycle of life. The village comes, the spirit of the village comes to the ice comes back to the village. Now, if that is an example of a fusion that has become the Latin American reality, a syncretic expression of that reality, there is one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice can be heard unfettered. And that is in this extraordinary coastal mountain range, the highest coastal mountain range in the world, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. that remains the homeland of 4 indigenous groups, the Kankwano, the Wiwa, the Kogi, and the Arawakos. These are the actual descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization. To this day, they look down from the heights of the mountains to the very beaches where their ancestors met Columbus's men on the 3rd voyage. To this day, they are ruled by a ritual priesthood, and the training for the priesthood is astonishing. It was reported first by Reichel Domatov that the young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which time the world only exists as an abstraction, as they are taught the values of their belief system, which includes the proposition that their prayers and rituals literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. They call themselves the elder brothers and dismiss the rest of us who have ruined the world as the younger brothers. Now, the interesting thing, and what happens is after 18 years, according to Reichel, the young priest-to-be is suddenly taken from the darkness, and he goes on a journey to the heart of the world, from the temple to the ice, and from the ice back to the sea. And as he's walking with the priest who has trained them, the Mamo says, you see, it's as I've promised you all these years. Imagine if you'd been told all your life that the earth was so beautiful, but you'd never seen a sunrise. You'd never seen a horizon. And then suddenly at 18, you're taken out, oh, that's what you've been talking about. Well, this was almost a fable in anthropology, which is almost too good to believe, because Reichel never went on a pilgrimage. And then something very special happened. This friend of mine, Danilo Villafana, walked into my room at the National Geographic with the Colombian ambassador, Carolina Barco. And the BBC, following on Reichel, had perpetrated the story, the old story that the Kogi were the real spiritual ones, which is complete nonsense. And the Arawakas were pissed. And they wanted their own film to make their statement. And I was looking at this man, Danilo, who was the governor of the community, and I said, I don't want to be rude, but you look an awful lot like an old friend of mine. And I pulled out a copy of my book, One River, and on the frontispiece page of one of the chapters was a photograph of his father. And I said, Danilo, you may not remember, but when you were a baby, I carried you on my back for weeks up and down the mountains with your dad. And his dad had been murdered by the Paracos, the paramilitary. So he just burst into tears. And based on that kind of connection, I said, and what I'd really like to do is take a journey to the heart of the world with you. And that's what we did. And we discovered that to this day, that people don't spend 18 years in the darkness. They probably never did. Doesn't make sense. But they do spend 18 years in the environs of the sacred temple on a prescribed diet, never able to leave that sacred space. And then they do go on a journey. And they do spend much of the time in the darkness learning this Baroque tradition until they go on this journey to Sarankwa, the ice-capped mountains. In fact, the hats they wear are a deliberate effort to mimic the snowfields on the heights of the world. And on the way, every single rock resonates with meaning. Offerings of coca are given. You get to the sacred lakes. And this is when we first tried to do that, we got to the penultimate stage of the pilgrimage, but then we nearly got kidnapped by the FARC. So we had to abandon everything and kind of sneak away in the nighttime. But we went back just last year. So these photographs are from that trip last year when we finally made it to the sacred lakes. But then the idea is you go back to the sea, completing this set of offerings where you bring objects from the ocean to the mountains, from the mountains to the sea. They literally describe their movements as threads, so that over the course of a lifetime, a human being weaves a cloak over Sarankwa. They say that the blood that flows in your veins is no different than the water that runs down a river. They say the hairs on your skin are just as the forests on the land. And this is a friend of mine, Mamo Camilo, who famously said to me, peace won't matter if it's just an excuse for the 3 sides of the conflict to come together and maintain a war against nature. It's time to make peace with the entire world. And I was fortunate enough to be able to pass that on to President Santos when we visited their community. And he made that the core of his speech that went out to the world. That's how incredibly amazing Colombia is. Now, I didn't plan really to have these images in here, but Catherine, where's Catherine? Catherine was a Peace Corps volunteer in Togo. In what year was it? I mean, you know what it's like to be a Peace Corps? I was once in Mali making a film in Dogon country, and out of nowhere came this skinny little American woman, so sweet. I said, "What are you doing here?" She was in the Peace Corps. The first thing I did is I took our satellite phone, I went, "Call your mother." and she was sweet, she did. And we, it's not easy to do what Catherine did, but it was an opportunity to remind you that, I mean, part of this work is to expose cliches that become pernicious. I did a lot of work in Haiti, and voodoo. And have you ever thought, like, why do you think voodoo's black magic? You ever thought about that? I mean, were I asked you to name the great religions of the world, what would you say? What continent's left out? Sub-Saharan Africa. The tacit assumption being that black people had no religion. Well, of course they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. It's just a distillation of very profound ideas that came out of the devotional practices of West Africa. It's, in a way, a most democratic religion because people don't have just direct access to the divine. They become the god. In other words, Haitians would always say to me, "You white people go to church and speak about God. Indians eat their magic plants and speak to God. We dance in the temple and become God." And that's the essence of spirit possession. And the reason we think of voodoo as being something awful is because Haiti was the only independent black nation for 100 years. It defeated the forces not just of Napoleon, but of Spain and England. It then funded shipments of slaves and bought them their freedom instead of leaving them on the shores of the American South. It funded Simon Bolivar on the condition that he liberate the slaves of Gran Colombia. And of course, the US Marine Corps occupied Haiti in 1915 and stayed for 20 years, and everybody got a book contract. And these were mostly Marines from the American South during the era of Jim Crow. The books had names like Black Baghdad, Cannibal Cousins, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, A Puritan in Voodoo Land, The Magic Island, the White King of Laguna. There are dozens of these books, all of them filled with children bred for the cauldron, zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, and voodoo dolls that don't even exist. They became the RKO movies of the 1940s, and they suggested to the American public that any country where such abominations occurred could only find its redemption through military occupation. And that's the genesis of the notion that voodoo is a black magic cult, but it's nothing of the sort. The idea, it's like any religion, it's got a healing element, spiritual element, but the extraordinary idea is that, and all religion, the sacred's different than religion. Sacred's around us all the time. The religion's all about death. Religion is all about what happens to us after death. In fact, every major religion is simply an effort to wrestle with eternity and come out on top, right? But here, the idea is that when you die, your tibonage, your essential personality, spirit, becomes part of the ancestral pool of energy. And out of the pool of energy emerge archetypes, 401 law of the pantheon, and they respond to a greater God. But you can invoke those spirits through dance and chanting, so the soul of the living person is momentarily displaced by the God. And so you become a God. And as a God, how can you be harmed? And so that's why you see in Togo theatrical expressions cutting into the skin to show the power of faith. And we have that in the Pentecostal church, of course, with snake handling. Or in this case, in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance handling burning coals with impunity. A rather astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. So voodoo is not a black magic cult. It's simply the spiritual expression of the human heart coming out of equatorial West Africa. Well, anyway, we have this idea, don't we, that these cultures, quaint and colorful though they may be, are somehow destined to fade away as if by natural law. Nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is never a threat to culture. Change is never a threat to culture. What is a threat to culture is power. In every instance, these are dynamic, living peoples, not fading away, but by being driven out of existence by identifiable force. Now, Pete Brosius has spent his entire professional life committed to the Penang of Sarawak in Borneo. And when I first went to, I actually went there by accident. My first book was made into the worst Hollywood movie in history. And Hemingway said that if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw your book over and go back to Tucson and get a drink. I didn't do that. I had an opportunity to disappear to where Pete works in Sarawak. And the nomadic Penang were so astonishing. I should say all these photos are mine, except this is David Heiser, the next one's Ian McKenzie, and the next one's David Heiser. And there's something about nomadic society and oral traditions that is fascinating. So for example, in a nomadic society, how do you measure wealth when there's no incentive to really accumulate anything? And ultimately things have to be carried on your back as you move camps. Well, wealth can also be defined as the strength of social relations between people. And again, in a nomadic society, sharing becomes, and hunting society in particular, an involuntary reflex, because you never know who will be the next to get food. I once gave a cigarette to a Penang woman and watched her tear it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. Also in hunting societies, whether it's the Penang or the Inuit, there's a tremendous prohibition on social unrest in the sense of, in Inuit languages, we'll see in a minute, there are no swear words. The most powerful person is the one who speaks the less. And why is that? Well, if you and I are a nuclear hunting group and suddenly your cousins and I argue with you and you two with your wives or go off, leaving me alone, that means my kids by definition have a 2/3 less chance to eat that night. So there's this tremendous incentive for social solidarity. And again, in oral traditions, the vocabulary is a knowledge embedded in the memory of the best storyteller. And in the same way that you can hear the voice of a character when you read a novel, I've found that not just the Penang, individuals hearing voices of animals, such that the flight of a hornbill becomes a cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. And as Pete knows so well, by the time I got to Sarawak, really in a kind of naive but activist way in 1988, the sounds of the forest become the sounds of machinery. At that time, it was suffering the highest rate of tropical deforestation on Earth. And of course, the people have survived, but fundamentally, a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, that had been pursued effortlessly for centuries, even through all of its changes, was crumbling just along with the forest from which it was born. Now, if that kind of industrial intrusion represents, in a way, the most grotesque expression of our worldview, let's go to somewhere more antithetical than you can ever imagine. And that brings us to the deserts of Australia. We know from studies of the Y chromosome that the ancestors of the Australian Aborigines were the first humans to walk out of Africa 65,000 years ago, when we spread across the world in 40,000 years. They reached the most parsimonious of continents, and then they went walking. And they established roughly 10,000 clan territories, all of which were linked by a single idea, and that was a dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was the idea that the world both existed and yet was constantly being born. Now, when the British first washed ashore in Australia in the 18th century, they saw people that looked strange, had a simple material technology, but what really offended the British is that nowhere that they went did they encounter people who had any interest in improving upon their lot. And because optimism changed through time was the very ethos of European society, notions that died in the blood of Flanders of the Great War, but were very much alive during the early days of settlement in Australia, the British, in their inimitable way, concluded the Aborigines weren't humans at all. As recently as 1903, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Abos were human. In the 1950s, ranchers had quotas as how many Abos could be shot with impunity who trespassed upon their lands. In the 1960s, a great friend of mine from Alice Springs told me, when he was in school, there was a book called A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, used in the curriculum across the country, that included the Aborigines as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife in the country. And what was really going on was the failure of the British to understand the most subtle, beautiful devotional philosophy in the world. The entire purpose of life in Australia was the opposite of progress. It was stasis. Your goal in life wasn't to change anything. It was to do the ritual gestures along the song lines. And the song lines were trajectories walked by the ancestral beings when they sang the world into existence. And the clan territories are all traversed by these song lines. And like this is Morning Star song line in Arnhem Land. And the whole purpose of life was to maintain the world as it was at the time of its creation. It would be like all Western intellectual thought going into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. Now, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. Had we followed this devotional philosophy, we would not have put a man on the moon. But we also wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the biological life supports of the planet. If industry is one culprit, if you will, a far more insidious one is ideology. This is a photograph of a nun I met at Angkor Wat whose feet and hands have been severed from her body during the era of Pol Pot for the crime of pursuing her Buddhist faith. And if we go for a moment into the mountains of Tibet, where I've spent a great deal of time, we'll understand what it meant when Mao Zedong, the man who was responsible for the murder of more of his people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together, when he whispered into the ears of a young Dalai Lama that all religion is poison, His Holiness knew what to expect. Once the Red Guard took over Lhasa in 1959, an estimated 1.2 million people were killed for their faith. 6,000 religious structures were reduced to dust. And what was it about the Buddhist Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists of Beijing? Well, it's all distilled, as you know, in the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life was negation. He meant that shit happens. The second of the Noble Truths is the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths is a revelation that ignorance can be overcome. And of course, the fourth is the delineation of a spiritual practice, a devotional path that, if followed, creates not only the possibility of the transformation of the human heart, but the certainty that that transformation will happen. This is a science of the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism. And I wanted to make a film on this theme, and I was very lucky enough to hook up with someone who became a very good friend of mine, Mathieu Ricard. Now, Mathieu's father was France's most illustrious Descartesian philosopher. His mother was a famous painter. His home was the watering hole of luminaries. If you can believe it, he learned photography from Henri Cartier-Bresson, piano from Stravinsky, anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He himself was studying molecular biology in the lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute outside of Paris, when one day he realized there was no correlation between fame, wealth, and happiness, and he wanted to be happy. So he went back to Nepal, became ordained as a Tibetan monk. I must tell you that he's now, of course, the translator of His Holiness in Europe, but to be able to be alone with Mathieu for a month in the Himalaya was like being able to be with Friar Tuck in Sherwood Forest. It was just and also on her trip with Shara Barma, a traditional Amsterdam doctor, here quizzically examining my urine sample. And beginning at Shiwang Monastery, under the blessing of Trista Rinpoche, the late head of the Nyingma tradition, a monastery that clings like a swallow's nest to the mountains of the Himalayan Solukhumbu, we went on a journey of the heart to find a real hero, but not a Western hero. All these mountaineers that would pace by us as they assaulted Everest, climbing into a zone of oxygen deprivation where consciousness is obliterated just to get on top of a mountain. From the Buddhist perspective, that's just about the stupidest thing you can do with a precious incarnation. We went to see an Eastern hero, and this was a woman, a frail but beautiful woman, forced by poverty to become betrothed to a wealthy merchant. She didn't want to marry, she wanted a devotional life. So she escaped the clutches of the wedding ceremony, and crawling down a human latrine and covered with human excrement, she escaped to the Tembuche monastery, where the monks cleaned her up and then dispatched her across the 19,000-foot Nangpa Pass into Tibet, where she became ordained as a Tibetan nun, came back over the mountains, and went into lifelong retreat as a Sasampa Ani, devoting her entire sentient existence to the recitation of a single mantra. She was sick and old, and Sherab was treating her, so we had a chance to meet her. So we began this extraordinary journey into the heart of the Himalaya, past the cave where Sherab, as part of his 7 years of medical training, spent 1 year in solitary meditative retreat. With Mathieu outside chanting the sutras, we finally made our way to this remote nunnery. And this next photograph I took as sunlight fell on this woman's face for the first time in 45 years. And you should think, and would think, that the woman's face and the woman that we greeted would be insane. She had spent all that time in a cell no bigger than this little corner of the room here. And yet when light fell upon her face, it fell upon a face that sparkled with joy. And she immediately gave away all benefit for her spiritual practice to all sentient beings. She immediately took Mathieu to task for the unnecessary Baroque devotions of the male-dominated monasteries. And as we eventually left her to her devotions, Mathieu said to me, "This is a proof of the legitimacy of the science of the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism, the serenity achieved by the practitioner." And later that week, at a nearby monastery, a monk said something to me really amazing. "You know, we in Tibet don't believe you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do." And so the Tibetans leave it to us to ask why we continue, as they're inspired by the Diamond Sutra that says that life is but a candle in the wind. Why do we continue to tolerate the wrath of China that still has its jackboot onto the heart of a nation and a civilization that has given so much to the world? So at the end of the day, you have to ask, what kind of world do we want to live in? Margaret Mead said before she passed that her greatest fear was, as we drifted toward this sort of blandly amorphous generic world culture, not only would the entire diversity of the human spirit fade away, but we'd wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that even such diversity could exist. The issue is not the traditional versus the modern. It's the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. Nobody is suggesting that anybody be sequestered like some kind of zoological specimen, frozen in time. We're only saying that people should have the right to benefit from all the genius of modernity, from science to technology to medicine, but critically without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. And the reason for that is not an issue of decency or human rights. It's about geopolitical stability, because culture is not trivial. Culture is not decorative. Culture isn't the clothing we wear, the songs we sing, the prayers we utter. Ultimately, culture is a body of moral and ethical values that we place around each human being, a blanket that insulates ourselves from the barbaric heart that history teaches lies within all of us. It's culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in the universe, to do what Lincoln said, seek the better angels of our nature. And when culture is lost, chaos ensues. And everywhere around the world where you find conflict, you're seeing a conflict of misunderstanding and a breakdown of culture, particularly as people seduced to the allure of the modern find themselves only on the bottom rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere. Mercifully, nation states are waking up. You know, when the British first reached the Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong, but one did more to honor the human dignity. And what the British failed to understand is that there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in the Arctic landscape where there was no wood, and everything had to be forged from the cold. Modern anthropology was born on Baffin Island when Franz Boas found himself in a blizzard, absolutely helpless for his well-being, his life saved by the Inuit people. I was once polar bear hunting with the Inuit. The temperature that day dropped to minus 65 Celsius, and that was before the storms whipped up. I had never felt more exposed and barren. And this is the genius of the Inuit people. And I was narwhal hunting. It's actually a funny story. Maybe I have to skip this one. I can't tell a shit knife story at dinner. So during the 1950s, a dark period of Canadian history when we forced the Inuit and settlements to establish our sovereignty to the extent that we did in the Arctic, this family, Olaik and Martha's father, refused to go. The family, fearful for his life, took away all of his weapons. Now you have to understand that the Inuit don't fear the cold, they take advantage of it. A moist towel left out overnight is a shovel by dawn. The runners of their sleds were originally made of fish, 3 Arctic char laid in a row, wrapped in caribou hide and greased with fresh water. And the family took away his weapons, thinking that would force him into the settlement. No, in the middle of the night, he slipped away, defecated into his hand, and when the feces froze, he made it into a knife, killed the dog with it, skinned the dog, used the rib cage of the dog as a sled, harnessed up a living dog, and disappeared into the night. Talk about getting by with nothing. And everybody thought this was a prophecal, but if you read Peter Freuchen, who traveled with Knud Rasmussen, the Fifth Two Legs, Freuchen gets trapped out in the tundra and he's in a coffin of his own making beneath his sled. And he says in his journal, I thought of making a shit knife, but I couldn't really maneuver. It's not like there's an assembly line creating shit knives, you know. But actually, a lab, I think it was Ohio State, heard this from me, and they launched an entire shit knife investigation. And someone started to eat the food, they froze their shit, and then, of course, they tried to show that the knife could be used to cut pig meat, pig skin. And when this came out, I couldn't believe it, that your tax dollars was going into this academic research. And of course, what I had said was that they had used a shit knife to skin a dog. And anyone who's cut away bacon from a rind of pig knows that pig rind ain't the same as dog skin. And they weren't using this to kill walrus up there. It was like dogs, right? And it's just a beautiful story of the survival of the people. And of course, now their life is threatened because the world beneath them is melting because of climate change. I want to just end today, and I know you've been patient, with one really beautiful story. Right after 9/11, I wanted to tell a story of Islam. And so we traveled to Mali, and we spent time with the Dogon, and then we moved from Timbuktu, which was the great southern port in the Sea of Sand that is the Western Sahara. And we wanted to go to Timbuktu because at a time when Paris and London were hovels, Timbuktu had 25,000 university students. It was one of the great centers of Islamic learning: Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and Timbuktu. Even today in Timbuktu, you can hold in your hands the documents that allowed the wisdom of the ancient Greeks to survive to inform the Renaissance. All of this passed through the minds of these great Islamic scholars. These are documents from the 10th century: cosmology, botany, chemistry, astronomy. And from Timbuktu, we then went north to an ancient salt mine called Taudeni. And this was along the route that used to carry African gold to Europe. Until the discovery of the New World, 2/3 of Europe's gold came overland from equatorial West Africa, 52 days from Timbuktu to Marrakesh and then to Europe. And today, you cannot marry if you're a Berber or Tamashek if you have not done the journey to the mine. 24 days on camel, each direction, and it is said to hone the devotion of the young Islamic boy or girl. And as we made our way to this ancient mine, I was with a friend of mine, Isa Muhammad, and it was during the Tuareg rebellion. So we had no idea all these hangers-on who kept joining our little effort, but it was so beautiful to see them put down their guns 5 times a day and simply turn to Mecca and pray. And as we finally got to the mine, my friend Isa Muhammad, who was this massive Tuareg fellow, took one look at the place and he said, "I would not bring my wife here." It was totally medieval. And I met someone at the mine, and this salt, incidentally, used to trade ounce for ounce with gold. It was not seen as a condiment. It was a sacred essence. It was a commodity. And I met this man toward the end of the stay, and he had been trapped at the mine in debt peonage. He had taken money from a money lender in his home community of Jannah, and he had never been able to pay back the debt. That's a classic way that people become entrapped in poverty and slavery, really. And I looked at his age. He was actually younger than me, but his body was broken. He had spent summers out at the mine when it's so hot, they say the sand melts. And I looked at his daily production of salt, what he paid to the caravans, and it was clear that he was never in his life going to get back to his family. And he had borrowed that money to save the life of his daughter. And the bill that kept him imprisoned in this place for all of his life was less than the cost of a dinner here in Athens for 4 people. So I gave him the money, and as soon as I did, I heard this sandstorm, just this huge sandstorm swept through the mine and enveloped him in yellow mist. And I can hear his voice blessing Allah as the sand enveloped him. And to this day, I don't know if he was telling me the truth. I don't know if he got free. I don't know if he was killed for the money. But as we moved south to Timbuktu, we came upon a caravan in the desert that we had encountered as we had moved north. And they had been struck by an unusual rainstorm, and if the salt gets wet, it breaks and loses all value. So they had been forced to stop until the salt would dry out. And that left them, 8 men, all their camels, all the wealth of their families, 250 miles from the nearest well, down to 1 liter of water. Now, you can live for 2 weeks with no food, but death from dehydration can come overnight. The truck drivers, the smugglers of Mauritania, say that the great thing about brake fluid is it keeps you off the battery acid. And as we came upon them, they had just dispatched this man, I took this photograph, to walk 25 miles or more to a depression where they thought they could dig and get some water. But what did they do as we came into their camp? They immediately kindled a twig fire, and with their last liter of water, brewed us tea, honoring the obligation of the Bedouin to kill the last goat that brings the milk that keeps your children alive to feed a wandering stranger who comes in from the cold and the darkness in need of rescue. Because in the desert, you never know when you will be that person in need of human companionship. And as I watched Muhammad pour me that first glass of tea, I thought to myself, these are the moments in a sordid world that allow all of us to hope and to love. Thank you very much.